Hey, Molly, thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, thank you, Michael. It's great to be here.
We're talking to Molly Wilmington. She is the author of this incredible new book that B&H has put out, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, The Teacher Who Became a Spy. It's a children's book. Molly, I love children's books. I learn from children's books, and I know children learn from children's books as well. That's the goal. Tell me how you got involved in this, Molly, and why you wanted to write a book about Dietrich Bonhoeffer for children.
Well, like you and I were talking about, we learn so much from children's books. And when my kids were little, I would take them to the library, and I spent several years staying home full time with them. And so I saw that as part of, my responsibility to help my kids learn about life. And I wanted them to have some more heroes. It was a shame that the Batman movies and things like that were so dark, because my son in particular, well, my daughter too, were very brave and bold and love to dress up and battle with the lightsabers and the swords and all that. So I wanted them to have some more stories. And I also ran into where if I read to my children at home about the people from the Bible, then they were bored in Sunday school. So I limited how much I told them those stories and tried to augment it with other things that they weren't going to be hearing about in Sunday school. I had been hearing about Bonhoeffer for many years. And when I went to Baylor University, I saw during our chapel time, so, the big assembly, an actor came and put on a one-act, kind of play of Bonhoeffer reading his letters and papers from prison. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, what a great witness, and wanting to learn more about Bonhoeffer, but also asking myself, what would I have done during World War II? And I'm very much of a person who's always defended the weak and, liked sports and going after things and being bold and courageous, but also compassionate. And all those things drew me to Bonhoeffer. I also felt called to ministry at a young age in my teenage years, and didn't know what that was going to look like exactly, but did go to college and studied some children's literature while I was there. Was an English major. And then I went to seminary. And long story short, once I started having kids, I had already been thinking I'd like to write a children's book. And I saw gaps where there weren't books. And I kept looking for some of my favorite people. And William Wilberforce and Dietrich Bonhoeffer were two of those. I had seen the movie Amazing Grace about William Wilberforce. Phenomenal movie. It reminds me of Chariots of Fire. Just love it. And my son, when he was 2, that was his favorite movie, Chariots of Fire, which just goes to show that action and the singing and the friendship and the challenges and all that. So the same with William Wilberforce. He was working together with other people to end the slave trade in England. And it opened my eyes to see, how can we as a community work together? We don't all have to be William Wilberforce. We don't all have to be on the radio or leading podcasts, but we can know the people who do and get the word out and work together. And Wilberforce and that Clapham sect, they worked together to reform the hospitals, which is why so many hospitals are named after, Baptist, Catholic, Methodist. They reformed the prisons, the mental institutions, the schools, and then also, with taking liquor out of the city and, the hard liquor, gin, things like that, replacing it with beer. Now, you might think, oh, well, that's so great. They did that in a year. No, when you watch that movie, Amazing Grace, you see how it was years and years. And, most of his life was laboring and not winning, and then going again and again. And so that, again, opened my eyes for how can we work together? And that about that same time, I became involved in pregnancy care and helping people understand what kind of care there was out there for men and women and their children. And I now work full-time in a pregnancy center.
Oh.
So I, back again, when my kids were little, I had kept thinking, well, maybe I'll write on Wilberforce. And then, kind of long story, I can go into it more, but this is kind of a shorter interview. I had several connections and got a text message, and it was kind of my green light for the publishing world. But it did take me 8.5 years to get to this point. But the great thing, the great thing about that is I always knew that everything I was doing was serving God. And if this book never came out, it's okay. you just kind of hold it loosely and keep praying. And God kept providing and guiding me. But it's so exciting now to have this book and to share it with kids and share it with families, and whole families will read it together. I know you have
Yeah.
7-year-old and 2 10-year-old twins.
Yeah. Yeah. They're now 11, but yeah, I will read this to them as well. Molly, one thing that I'm really impressed with in the book is it's of course it's educational and it's inspiring, but it's also fun and humorous. I'm just kind of share with people a little bit about it. It starts out with Shep, the sheepdog, and he's the one that kind of tells the story. So he takes the kids on a journey, and it's also humorous. There's one page in there that talks about Bonhoeffer mailing his friends a postcard of a bull and a matador, and he glued his own picture atop the picture of the matador, and he was just joking with them. I forgot what the word. They're like, hello from the
greetings from the matador.
Matador, yeah. And then there's another page that kind of adds to the fun about his family making jelly for him when in prison. And so I just want to share that with folks. So it's not just this hard-edged book about Bonhoeffer versus the Nazis. It has a little bit of fun in it. But that kind of leads me to my next question, though. What were the challenges of writing a children's book about Bonhoeffer?
Well, I modeled it after 2 of my favorite books, how you brought up kind of the fun. I knew that for parents and kids to read a book more than once and to buy a book, frankly, there has to be something that draws them back. So there were books that I would read, say, about George Washington, and they were good and they told the story, but it wasn't really captivating. You would look at it and say, okay, I read that. But then there was another book about Washington that was called George Washington and the General's Dog. And the way that one is approached is where you start off by talking about how Bonhoeffer loved animals, and then you zero in on how he loved dogs, and you talk about his dogs. Then it transitions into talking about how Washington took the animals into battle with him because they brought companionship and safety and also helped with hunting. Well, what happened is General Howe from England, his dog ended up in the revolutionaries camp, and it actually said the dog's name and property of General Howe. So they all raised the white flag, returned the dog, and then went back to fighting. So, that's the central part, but there's also just the lightness about the dogs and the animals. And there is this one scene that shows all the people from the revolutionary camp, huddled around the fires, and they're cold. So you can get a little of the serious, but then it ends at the end of the book where all these people sent from different countries, like donkeys and dogs and poodles to him. So you have that fun. And another one was about, you'll like this since you're partly from Tennessee, about Davy Crockett.
Yeah.
And it was written by Robert Quackenbush. And Davy Crockett is known for wearing a raccoon skin hat and telling tall tales. So in this book, he's wearing a live raccoon skin hat. And there are some raccoons at the bottom of every page making wisecracks. And so I thought, well, why don't I put a dog narrator in? He'll lighten the tone and make it a little bit easier for kids, and then also find some stories that kids like. So that was the first thing I did, is I researched everything that I could find. I sat down with a librarian at Baylor, and we pulled things, and it confirmed that there was no Bonhoeffer children's book, a picture book, and there wasn't one on Wilberforce either. But then I also got some of these fun stories. So I put together an outline really quickly, and had my idea, and I decided to put a secret code in the book like Bonhoeffer used. So that's really fun for the kids to realize, oh, there's a code in here, and then to figure out how to solve it. So those kinds of things, again, will make you want to pick it up again and make it lighter. But then there is a little bit more serious theme throughout the book of Bonhoeffer being like an obedient sheepdog who followed Jesus, the Good Shepherd, and stood firm against the evil wolf Hitler. So there's just one picture of Hitler in the whole book, and he's at a distance, and he doesn't look too scary. But I mostly just talk about the Nazis, but Hitler does come back in at the end. But it's a joyful book. When people read it, they say they found hope. It ends with Bonhoeffer leading a worship service in prison.
Yeah.
And the kids like this part as much. They like how he shared food and scripture and prayed with people in prison, and how he, even though he was sad, he read the scriptures, and especially the Psalms, and I refer to Psalm 23. And through that, again, it's pointing everything back to how, no matter where you are in your life, how can you ask God, how can you use me today? What can I do? Even if you're sad or it's dark times. And then the very last page ends with Bonhoeffer being taken away to be killed. I don't say how he dies. I don't say how Hitler dies. Keep it very light. But I do say that he was leading a worship service, and he turned to the other prisoners and he said, "This is the end, but for me, the beginning of life." And then the very last page is of Bonhoeffer praying, looking up toward a light. And then Shep the sheepdog puppy is looking at us with this joyful kind of knowing look. And he's saying, Bonhoeffer knew this was not really the end, and that he would go on and live forever in heaven with Jesus, the Good Shepherd, his Good Shepherd. Yeah.
Love it.
So,
Love the ending. I love. I've read the Washington dog book.
Yeah.
I think we have that, and so I know exactly what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, by the way, this is an aside. This is kind of free, I guess, but that's where adult books go off track in teaching history. We don't tell the personal side of people, and that's sometimes the interesting part of it. And so I love the part. I love the postcard part. I love all that stuff. And I know you have a military people in your family. How did that kind of inspire you or help you in writing?
My whole life has been affected because of war. My father fought in Vietnam, and my mom found out she was pregnant with her third child, not me, I'm the fourth, when my father had left for Vietnam. So she had a 1-month-old, a 3-month-old, and a baby on the way. And now my father is, an officer off to Vietnam. And so that was really hard for them. And then thankfully he came home, and I was born a year later. But then he died young, partly due to doctor malpractice, but he was still in the military. And it was really hard on our family now not to have my father, and part of it was due to the war. And so I knew my father loved us so much that he was willing to protect us. His first assignment was 3 years in Germany. So he was there from 65 to 68, which is amazing, right? That's just 20 years after the war. He's not German, but he studied German, the German language, and probably was wanting to go to Germany to help. So I actually grew up seeing pictures of Germany and hearing good stories about it. So I knew about that. And then my mom's family, there is some German on her side, and her father came here when he was a teenager from the Netherlands. So he was born in Rotterdam and came here, and he wanted to, so my mom was born on the 1-year anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And then he went off to fight, and he was an enlisted man, and he wanted to fly planes, but they wouldn't let him because he spoke 6 languages, which was a danger. He spoke German, Dutch, and probably French, English, and a couple more. But he suffered. He would not talk about the war. He was an alcoholic. And my mom grew up with that. And that was really hard. Thankfully, she did have another sister, and he lived to be older, but it was really hard. And again, I'm so thankful for the people who do defend us. And I'm thankful for the pastors who stand up, and the theologians, and my husband's a theologian. How do we engage in society? But also the people who are doing like what you do, to being on the radio and sharing Bonhoeffer's story and Jesus' story and entertainment. Again, Amazing Grace was a major eye-opener to me about how God could use me. And then also the movie Valkyrie is such a great movie. Bonhoeffer's family was part of that plot. That's why he was in prison. He was that same group. In fact, his uncle, von Hase, was one of the main people in charge in Berlin during that whole Valkyrie. And he was killed. 2 of Bonhoeffer's brother-in-laws, and then one of Bonhoeffer's brothers. And Bonhoeffer even had a brother who died in World War I when Bonhoeffer was 13. And so that's when he started asking questions about war and death and what is our responsibility. So his whole life was kind of centered around that as well.
This can certainly be a springboard for children to learn more about Bonhoeffer the whole war. I mean, depending on the age, I guess, and what the
Mm-hmm.
parents. Just briefly, what do you want? What do you want children and families to take away from this book? What's kind of the message that you want them to think about
Well,
when they're
I think Bonhoeffer would be very happy to know that this book is really not about him. It's about following Jesus, the Good Shepherd. And I use scripture throughout the book. I do quote a line from Philippians about standing firm in one spirit. I also reference how Bonhoeffer decided to become a spy because he knew that was the best way that he could continue to follow God and to stand up for his neighbor. So I say that he followed the two greatest commandments, to love God and love neighbor. Of course, I've simplified it for children. So that's an area where families can have more conversation about those scriptures. And, they're in the Old Testament too. And how has this been part of God and God's people, our stories all this time? And then there's also obviously references to John 10 and then to Psalm 23 as well.
This, of course, is the first in a series of B&H books. I forgot what the series is called. It's
Here I Am. Yeah,
Here
it's called the. Mm-hmm.
The next one is C.S. Lewis. The one after that, I believe, is Lottie Moon. Those are authors besides you, but it's awesome for you to be launching this series. Do you have any thoughts on the importance of teaching kids about heroes of church history and why parents, Christian parents especially, should want to do that?
Kids know that there is danger in the world and evil, and that we should all take care of one another and stand up for one another. And there's some practical ways in this book that kids can see putting your faith in action, with how Bonhoeffer loved children and his students and took care of them. And that's in the beginning. And then also, again, sharing scripture, sharing food. And kids know sharing food is a sacrifice, especially when you're at lunchtime in your school and it's a limited amount of food. That's a big deal. So all of these things will help our children to be more resilient, but it's also meeting a need that's innate in all of us to become strong and learn how to defend and how to, all these skills. That's why kids love the idea of being a spy. It's hide and seek, it's secret notes, it's figuring out how to survive in this world. And I know that sounds a little dark, but I didn't mean for it to. But it's also about perseverance, and that there is suffering in the world. Bonhoeffer spent 12 years of his life under Hitler's rule. And the very first month, they could have their mail read, their houses searched, and their phones tapped. That's 12 years. His life was drastically changed by that. He didn't get to work in the university after a few years. He didn't really get to be a pastor after a few years. He had to have a secret seminary, and he was even engaged when he died and didn't get to be married or have children. So that sacrifice and following God is an important part of understanding how this world works and our place in it.
I did not ask you, so I should probably ask you, for those who want to know, what is the target audience for this book? I know children is kind of...
Yeah, 6 to 9-year-olds, but it's appropriate for younger kids and older. I made sure, again, not to talk about the atrocities. I do say things like prison camps that the parents could then talk about a little bit more, but I don't say concentration camp. And, I say that Bonhoeffer dies and Hitler dies, but I don't say how.
You're fine. Listen, we've changed so much in the past 10, 15 years. Our culture's watching superhero movies now that are far more revealing than what this book does. But I do want parents to know kind of the target age. It's wonderful, Molly. I would encourage people to get it. We've been speaking with Molly Wilmington. She's the author of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, The Teacher Who Became a Spy. It's published by B&H Books. Molly, thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been a joy.